Mhm.
Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for the second webinar in our Crohn's and Colitis Patient Education webinar series for 2021. My name is Bronwyn Kears and I am the Manager of Education and Engagement, and I'm very excited to be the facilitator of tonight's program. Now, without further ado, I'm very honored to introduce our speakers for the first portion of tonight's program. Dr. Peter Higgins from Michigan Medicine and Dr. Millie Long from the University of North Carolina. And before they begin their presentation, I'd love to give you all some background information on the both of them so you can get to know them a little bit more. Dr. Higgins received his bachelor's degree and medical degrees from Duke University. He also completed a fellowship in gastroenterology at the University of Michigan in 2004 and a Master of Science in Clinical Research Design and Statistical Analysis at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Dr. Higgins is currently the Medical Director of Ambulatory and Chronic Diseases at Michigan Medicine, and his research focuses on IBD and is interested in the molecular mechanisms of intestinal fibrosis, which leads to intestinal blockages and surgery. His clinical research includes studies on patient-reported outcomes in inflammatory bowel disease, medication holidays after long-term remission in IBD, and biomarker-guided therapy in IBD. And also joining Dr. Higgins this evening is Dr. Millie Long. Dr. Long received her medical degrees from the University of Virginia in 2002. She then completed residency in internal medicine and a chief residency at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. She completed multiple fellowships in gastroenterology and hepatology, preventative medicine, and inflammatory bowel disease, all of these being at the University of North Carolina. She's currently Associate Professor of Medicine in the Department of Medicine and Director of the Gastroenterology and Hepatology Fellowship Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research interests include prevention of complications for inflammatory bowel disease, women's health, and clinical epidemiology. We're very excited to have both Dr. Higgins and Dr. Long join us this evening, and I'd love for them to go ahead and shoot with their presentation. Thank you both.
Great. And if we can head over to slide 1, I'm going to start out with some of the first few slides and then hand it off to Dr. Long. Along the way, we're going to invite some input from our knowledgeable patients, but we're going to talk about how clinical trials go from the first dose in humans to actually being drugs available to you through clinical trials. Dr. Long and I run IBD clinical trials, both at the University of Michigan and the University of North Carolina, and are heavily involved in recruiting and treating patients through clinical trials. And on the next slide, I think we may have missed one there. I think we skipped past one. Just to give you scale, and you've probably heard about or read about these recent COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials. These are obviously very accelerated, but also very large trials. 43,000 adults were enrolled in the Pfizer trial with 2,300 children, 30,000 in the Moderna trial, another 30,000 in the AstraZeneca trial, and 60,000 in the Janssen trial. Just to give you a sense of how big these trials are, a really large phase 3 program in IBD, for example, the Stelara for Crohn's program, enrolled just over 1,700 patients across 2 different trials. So quite a bit smaller. And part of that is it's relatively hard to find Crohn's patients in the middle of a flare who are interested in enrolling in clinical trials. But this is what we need to do to test new therapies and get new therapies available to patients. So next slide. And I wanted to show you an example. Dr. Long and I don't actually just recruit other people for clinical trials. We actually participate. On the left is a picture of myself and my mom, Marnie Higgins, enrolling in a COVID vaccine trial for, in this case, the AstraZeneca vaccine back in November. And it was the first vaccine trial for me. It was actually her second vaccine trial, and the first one was in 1954. And just as a bit of trivia, if anybody can guess which trial that was in 1954, let's see if you can come up with that and put that in the Q&A panel. And on the right, I'll have Millie take over there.
Sure. Can you guys hear me? I apologize. My Zoom crashed earlier. Great. Perfect. Yes. And so just as Peter said, not only do we help our patients to participate in trials, but we also ourselves and our children, in this case for me, have been active in the Pfizer COVID vaccine trial for adolescents. And so the idea that we can hopefully protect them, but also really learn so much more about the vaccine for people that couldn't participate in those trials. And so just really glad to be a part of research that's moving forward, particularly in this domain where it's so important with COVID vaccine.
And I want to mention Jeffrey Lemke and Ashley Ongst were our rapid on the get-go trivia winners. My mom was in the polio vaccine trials in 1954, along with 5 of her siblings. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So what is a randomized controlled trial, which we usually call an RCT? It's a research study in which individuals, participants, are allocated at random to receive one of several interventions. Of course, there have to be at least 2 to choose from. The RCTs are experimental, and the intervention is controlled by the investigator in single-site trials, or usually by a large central computer system to randomize people in multi-center trials. And they're usually comparative studies. You're testing 2 different drugs or 2 different doses or a combination thereof against each other to see which is more effective, which is safer, and if there are differences. And we don't do clinical trials unless we have something called clinical equipoise. And that means that we think there is reason to believe it's equally likely that one arm is just as good as another arm, where we don't have enough evidence yet that the new drug, whatever that might be, or new treatment or device, is necessarily better than nothing at all. So we have to have enough uncertainty that we feel like it's ethical and fair to randomize people to either of these treatments for a particular disease or condition. So
in terms, do you want to go ahead, Peter, or me? Either way. In terms of how these therapies get to patients, I think it's very important as a clinical trial investigator. I do think as I'm educating my patients about trials to kind of understand where the phases are. Because preclinically, this is work in test tubes in animals. It helps us to understand the efficacy, the safety, and a model of the disease. Phase 1 is often healthy participants that they can understand dosing and side effects. Phase 2 is often a study within the disease state, looking at efficacy across dose ranges. And phase 3 are the type of trials that actually bring these drugs to market. These are the large clinical trials, often compared to placebo, sometimes compared to an active comparator, with many participants to help to demonstrate the efficacy and safety. But I think equally as important, so after that phase 3 study, the FDA does a review, says, yes, this is safe and effective for patients with this disease. But then the drug is still studied in clinical practice. And this is what's called phase 4. This is real world data. This is once, and many of you may have participated in some of these studies, or heard about them. It's the idea of understanding how the drug is used in clinical practice, and then using that data to further inform the safety and particularly the efficacy in real world populations that may be somewhat different than those very select populations that participated in the clinical trials. And so just to emphasize, many patients in our clinical trials unit, we do a large number of phase 3 studies. These are the studies kind of right before approval, where we have a good bit of data in terms of not only animal data, but data in healthy volunteers and data in the disease state. So we're really pretty far along in the process, and we can really inform our patients as to what the potential side effects may be and the potential benefits. And so the idea that we have a reasonable amount of data behind us once we get to that phase, I think is really important.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about preclinical studies. And in my lab, we do some preclinical studies of new medications for inflammation, and especially new medications for fibrosis in Crohn's disease. And typically we start off with, is this therapy safe in animals and is there any evidence of efficacy? And if you're trying to take a drug to use in patients, you have to start with proving safety, usually in at least 2 species. These are commonly both mice and rats. And you need as many weeks of safety data in rodents before you can even go into humans. So if you want to do an induction study in humans, you have to have 8 to 16 weeks of safety data in mice and rats that have been dosed repeatedly over that period of time. If you want to do a maintenance study in humans, you can't even start until you've given it to mice and rats for at least a year and proven that it's safe, and looking at autopsies and blood levels and any evidence for liver damage or kidney damage, anything that would make you stop using that drug that looks dangerous in rodents. So the key thing, how do we test whether these are effective in an animal model? We actually have to give mice and rats colitis and then try to make them better. And generally, nothing's going to make it out of preclinical studies unless it's quite safe over time. And there's clear evidence that we can improve colitis in at least 2 different animal models. Excellent. So phase 1 studies.
Peter,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there was a good question from the audience. You had commented on that your lab does some work in fibrosis, and that fibrosis is one of the factors that you can give these mice. One of the participants asked, well, what is fibrosis?
Right. And it's sort of the fancy scientific term for scarring. And that's a big problem in both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, but it's a bigger problem in Crohn's disease because that scarring thickens the wall of the intestine and narrows the opening, the lumen that food goes through. And sometimes it can get so narrow that it's blocked and food backs up. People get bloated or distended, even have nausea or vomiting. And if there's a complete blockage, they are at risk of perforation, and generally at that point need surgery to open up that area and remove the damaged intestine. And currently, most of our therapies, or actually all of our therapies for IBD, are focused on blocking inflammation. And they don't necessarily reverse the damage done by scarring. It's kind of a hot research area right now to look at ways to slow down or reverse scarring. And a large Crohn's and Colitis Foundation study a few years ago, the RISK study, showed that at diagnosis in children, there was already starting to be scarring activity or fibrosis activity that you could find in biopsies. And if that was present, it would predict which children would go on to blockages earlier than other children. And so it's a marker of which patients are going down the road of scarring and blockages. And we're hopeful that we can develop new medications that can slow this down. So far, we're starting to have success in mice to slow down the scarring, but they were still a long way from bringing these kind of medications to humans.
Great. Other follow-up question for you, Peter. One participant asked, how do you give mice or rats colitis?
So the most common way, and sort of the simplest way, is to use some sort of chemical irritant. And often that involves breaking down the barrier between the gut lumen and the gut wall, often by doing damage by things like alcohol enemas, usually around 50% alcohol. And that does a fair amount of damage and causes ulcerations and openings in the wall. And then we usually add something else that's an immune system activator that gets into those ulcers and activates inflammation in the wall of the colon. And they can get a very vigorous colitis. And that's where we try to act and try to either do a induction of remission after the inflammation has occurred, or prevention studies where we put the animals on an anti-inflammatory before we induce the colitis.
Great, thank you.
So from there, if you have good safety and efficacy data, so we know the drug works and is safe in rodents, then we test safety in human volunteers. And these are what are called phase 1 studies. These are very small studies, usually done at clinical research centers in healthy volunteers. And these are often young, healthy people, often college students. And these are all about safety and determining the safest maximum tolerated dose, any side effects, any lab abnormality changes, the absorption of the drug, and the metabolism of the drug, how fast it gets broken down in healthy people. And we generally start with one dose. So we'll basically, bring people in for a weekend. They take one dose, and then we measure their blood levels over time. We measure for abnormalities of the liver or kidney or other organs, and determine how fast the drug gets cleared in healthy people. And then after 3 to 6 people at that dose, if it's safe and they're not having side effects, they increase the dose for the next 6 to 8 people and gradually increase it every 5 to 10 people until they reach a dose where they either start seeing lab abnormalities or side effects reported by the patients and know that's their limiting dose. Once they do the single ascending dose study, that single dose, then they'll do what's called a multiple dose, where they'll take that safe dose just below where they started seeing side effects and dose repeatedly in the same patient for up to a week and see if you get drug accumulation and new side effects if there's more drug in the body, to kind of model somebody taking this long term. And generally, if something bad happens in phase 1, that's pretty much the end of that drug. It's not going to go anywhere. But sometimes, especially in folks where absorption or metabolism might be different, like in IBD for an oral medication, sometimes they'll do a second phase 1 study called a phase 1b, mainly to see if absorption or metabolism is different in IBD patients, especially those who have inflammation in their intestines or have had surgery on their intestines, to make sure you still have good absorption.
So when we're thinking about phase 2 studies, this is, as I mentioned earlier, where you're actually starting to look within the disease state itself. So here, obviously, inflammatory bowel disease, either Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. And it's in actively sick patients. It's usually an induction study trying to induce remission. And typically, it's in the neighborhood of 100 to 300 patients. And there's a dose ranging to figure out what the least amount of dose is possible to have an optimal effect. And they certainly do confirm absorption and clearance of the drug in people with the disease state and determine if there's any sort of new toxicity. Look at benefits, clinical symptoms. Certainly here is where we also look at endoscopic findings. One of the real changes in clinical trials, probably over the past 20 years, has been this movement to help us to understand not only do our symptoms better, we do follow something called PROs, patient-reported outcomes, but are we actually seeing healing of the endoscopy, healing of the inflammation on the lining of the bowel? And the patients will do quality of life questionnaires. And all of this data helps us to then understand how many patients will be needed in a phase 3 study at an appropriate dose, which is learned in this study, to really be able to determine if this drug is effective at that point. And so these phase 2 studies are often kind of a little bit more short-term, whereas as we move on to these phase 3 studies, they really need very long-term safety data. And so for many of my patients who have participated in phase 3 studies, they sometimes will have 5, 6, 7 years of therapy so that we can really understand some of the safety data. So next slide. This was one example of a recent phase 2 trial. This was Upadacitinib, which is a selective JAK inhibitor for ulcerative colitis. And just to help you to understand some of the numbers, it often takes a lot of patients to evaluate to see if they're eligible. These trials have very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. And what I mean by that is they really want a population that has active inflammation that is pretty similar so that they can actually see a benefit in kind of something that is homogeneous. It looks the same. And so there were about 450 patients who were assessed, but of those, nearly 200 were excluded for various reasons. And then 250 patients were in the trial. And as you can see, as you follow this flow diagram down, there is a small percentage of patients, a fifth of the patients who were assigned to placebo, and the others were all assigned to different doses of this therapy, this upadacitinib. And that this study does is it allows them to see, well, how should we dose our bigger trial when we're looking at efficacy? And as you move down to the clinical response rate at the bottom, you can see that even with placebo, there's a small percentage of patients that do respond to nothing, meaning their disease is going to get better on its own. But then as you look across, it's quite clear that the higher doses here, the anywhere from 15 to 45 milligrams, did better than the 7.5 milligram dose. And so this helped this company be able to plan the dosing associated with their larger trial. Next slide. From a phase 3 perspective, these are really large studies, anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 participants. Still not as large as the Pfizer vaccine trials that Peter participated in and my kids participated in, but it's really pivotal for drug approval. And these usually have at least 2 different trials. And both of these trials need to show significant benefits to patients. They have to have appropriate safety. And usually there is a placebo comparison and 1 or 2 dose levels, depending on what won during phase 2. And usually there's at least a 2-to-1 chance to get active drug. Sometimes it's 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. And they often start with an induction trial, answering the question, can you make a sick IBD patient better? And that's usually in the neighborhood of 8 to 16 weeks. If you don't respond, typically in the trial design, it's possible that you could have been on placebo. We don't know. These are something called double blind. So the provider, I don't know, you don't know. But if you haven't responded after that initial induction trial, most trials will then give you an opportunity to have active drug at that point to see if you do respond. In that scenario, if you respond, you're eligible for a maintenance study. And then some trials will even do another feeder induction study to try to get enough patients into the maintenance, where they do what's called an open label induction, where everyone gets the drug, and then the patients are randomized to either placebo or the drug for the maintenance. Again, comparing patients to answer 2 questions. Remember, with any IBD therapy, we need to know, does it work to induce? Does it work to get the inflammation better? And then the second aspect of this, knowing that both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are chronic diseases, does it continue to control the inflammation and continue to keep that patient in remission? Both of those are needed and indicated for approval of a drug. Next slide. And then finally, one of my favorite aspects of clinical trials, and I know we're going to hear some of our patients' perspectives on this as well, is something called an open label extension. And so this means that, in a patient who's participated in a clinical trial, let's say they've done very well in induction, they've maintained their remission and maintenance, you certainly would hate for them to no longer have access to that drug after a year of getting into remission. And so for most of the trials that I participate in as an investigator, I really look for an open label extension, meaning that the company does need more safety data. They need more long-term data on how patients do on this drug, and it really allows them to look at safety issues. But most importantly for my patient participants is it can give them a more long-term access to the drug at no cost. I have some patients who are even in a 9-year open label extension that was continued even after the drug became commercially available. The idea of getting long-term access to drug at no cost because you participated in the initial randomized control trial. And usually they keep these open until the drug is approved so that everyone who needs to can transition to that therapy as part of clinical care. So this is a real advantage to participation in a clinical trial, and it's something to look for if you and or your provider are considering a clinical trial for your care.
Dr. Long, we have a question related to the development pipeline. We have an attendee who asks, how come it takes so long to develop new medicines for IBD compared to COVID vaccines?
Mm-hmm. No, it's very true. And I think that, one of the issues, I think one of the things Peter mentioned was how wonderfully fast these COVID vaccine trials were able to recruit, because essentially everyone was eligible. They wanted to look at this in a broad array of the general population. And so huge numbers participated within a month of each of these trials. In fact, for my kids, as soon as I heard about the trial, I got them in. They were interested in participating. But within 2 weeks, it was done, meaning that so many people wanted to participate that they had to close it out. In IBD trials, we don't see that. I think one of the main reasons why it can take so long is we really need to be certain that we have all of the safety and efficacy data. So we need to make sure that all of the patients are enrolled in the trials, and we just have a much slower rate of recruitment because of very specific inclusion criteria. And the fact that, you know, people may not be aware of this as an option as much in terms of management. And I think that's probably the stark comparison. How else would you consider it, Peter?
I think one of the biggest issues is just straight up recruitment and numbers. In the vaccine trials at Michigan, I think the AstraZeneca filled up in 3 weeks and the Pfizer trial filled up in about 2 weeks. Typically for each center that opens an IBD trial, they enroll 1 patient every 3 months on average nationwide. So it's part of it is availability, interest. Obviously people are afraid of COVID and they want to get the best therapy available quickly. It's hard to get the word out and get people really interested in jumping into clinical trials.
Right.
There
totally agree.
A couple other questions. One was a child has scarring in the area where his TI was resected 4 years ago. Would a biological like Stelara help? Most of our current therapies are targeted at inflammation. That being said, most scarring in especially the early stages is a mixture of inflammation and scar. It's not usually pure one or the other. So it's possible if there's a lot of inflammation there that a biologic could help.
No, I agree completely. It's definitely possible it can help. There are other etiologies that can sometimes help with scar tissue, including stretching that area. And I will say there's some novel clinical trial agents, as Peter mentioned, that we don't yet have an approved agent for that fibrosis, that scarring, but there are some in development. The idea of adding an anti-fibrosis agent to an anti-inflammatory agent may help us to treat scarring just like that. And so, again, there may be things in the pipeline that will help.
And another question from Andrea Wilimowski. In phase 1, do they try to get people from different age groups so that all ages are represented?
I think in an ideal world, yes, but in what actually happens is, as you can probably imagine, they're testing these drugs in healthy volunteers, and there is some financial reimbursement because otherwise these people wouldn't be doing it. And I think on our slides we even mentioned it's often college students, you know, it is often young people, but certainly older individuals would be welcome, but it's more of kind of who can they get to participate in terms of understanding some of those drug distribution factors. And
particularly for the multiple dose trials, those are usually a week in a hotel or a clinical trial center. Basically, it's people who don't have jobs. So it's usually a mixture of college students and retired people. And not much in between because most people don't want to take off, rightfully, a week off to participate in a clinical trial that's phase 1. So we can move on to the next slide.
Great. So next slide. From an FDA perspective, I think it is important. And a lot of this has come up recently with the COVID vaccine as well, just to emphasize that they review all of the data, much more than what is published in papers. The new therapy needs to be a clear benefit. It needs to be safe. If there is a clear benefit, it is approved for marketing. But especially if the therapy is a biologic or as a new mechanism, they often will require these phase 4 studies that I mentioned after approval to further understand that safety relationship in other populations. Just as the question earlier, well, what about other age groups? What about people with other medical problems? Sometimes those people aren't included in the initial clinical trials. And so these phase 4 studies help us to understand how this drug may work in someone, let's say, for example, who has heart disease that wouldn't have been in the initial trial. And so it becomes very important as we look at more broad use of these therapies to understand it in everyone.
And we have a question from Pam Kincaid, who said, you mentioned stretching for the scarring. What is that? And that's an endoscopic procedure we use through a scope. So from the patient point of view, the procedure is the same as a colonoscopy, but we can reach up into the small intestine where a lot of this narrowing occurs. and slide in a balloon that we can inflate and stretch and slightly tear that scar tissue to open it up to let food go through and make that opening larger. And that often will make the scarring slow down, will often relieve symptoms. It's not necessarily durable. Sometimes we have to repeat it. And many, I'd say about half of the folks who require stricture dilation will end up going to surgery in about 5 years. So it does buy some time. And it really only is helpful if they're relatively short strictures, less than 3 inches long, for us to be able to do that endoscopically.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So just as we both mentioned earlier, these phase 4 studies really focus on safety, these registries. We'll show you a number of these. The Crohn's and Colitis Foundation has studies that do this, that follow people in the real world for observational effect of various medications. Usually they don't necessarily find anything new, but every once in a while, a signal comes out, and these become very important for helping us to counsel patients and understand about individual therapies. One example is the drug Tysabri or natalizumab. And this is a drug that, frankly, and I'll ask Peter, I no longer use in my practice. It has very minimal use in inflammatory bowel disease anymore because it can have a rare and very morbid complication of something called PML, progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, a very long word for a brain abscess that can occur that wasn't recognized initially in the clinical trials, but once this became more used in practice and these phase 4 studies recognized this rare complication, we were able to identify which patients were at risk for it. And certainly now we have other therapeutic options that don't have this risk. And so again, an important reason to keep doing these studies once these drugs are used in the real world. Anything to add to that, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, technically, you can use this drug for Crohn's disease, but the company doesn't market it, and the consent form to use it is really quite scary. So I haven't used it in at least 8 years. There are better and safer options, and I think that's really where a lot of clinical trials are going, is identifying effective and safer new options for IBD.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So Peter, this is your word cloud, so I think you have to describe it.
So I was involved in this study that interviewed patients with both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis and asked them what factors made them interested or disinterested in participating in clinical trials. What were their concerns? What were the things that would make them more likely to participate? And we learned a lot about what factors influence the perceptions of IBD patients in terms of should I or would I want to participate in clinical trials. Next slide. So the key takeaways, there were some significant barriers. The biggest one was fear, and particularly fear of the unknown, not knowing enough about clinical trials, not knowing enough about the therapy. I think people were particularly concerned about phase 1, where the drug's really new, and less concerned about phase 3, where you have experience in hundreds of patients. They were concerned about potentially going into a clinical trial when they had pretty severe flares, and they were concerned about the possibility of getting placebo when they were very sick and having to wait a long time for any kind of response. Potential adverse events was a big concern, and not knowing with a new drug, is there risk or new risk that I wouldn't know about? Time constraints were a big one that we hadn't necessarily recognized, but for a lot of patients, their health insurance is very much tied to their employment, and being able to not take off work was a big deal. Having to take off multiple days of work to participate in a clinical trial was regarded as a little bit risky in terms of maybe losing their job and maybe losing their health insurance. And how connected their primary IBD provider or their primary guest neurologist is to the clinical trial. A lot of folks were much more enthusiastic if their familiar GI doctor was participating in some way or referring them or recommending that particular trial. Patients also recommended things that might help increase participation, in terms of better communication and less jargony information about the clinical trials and the new therapies, reduced length of trial and time commitment, and people, particularly post-COVID, are more interested in remote visits, and could we do some of these visits by telehealth? Particularly lower placebo rates. They weren't really interested in one-to-one ratios. People really like the idea of open label extensions where you can get free effective drug for a long time, and having support from the patient's primary GI or primary IBD provider in identifying and helping them participate in clinical trials was considered a big factor. Next slide. So in general, participating in a trial means no cost to you or your insurance for the study testing or treatment. Travel and time expenses can be reimbursed by the sponsor, but it varies a lot, so it's worth asking. And sometimes it's worth, a lot of times they'll give you a certain number, maybe 55 cents a mile if you're traveling from a long distance to a center. And you can exit a trial at any time for any reason. For example, when I was in the AstraZeneca trial, I did both doses. I filled out my forms and questionnaires for 8 weeks, but then the Pfizer vaccine became available for healthcare workers in December, which was 95% effective. And I went ahead and got the Pfizer vaccine. I told the folks in the trial that yes, I would be getting this vaccine. They're continuing to collect my data. They're interested in what happens to people who get 2 different vaccines. So you're not locked into a trial if better treatment options become available. Just tell the study team you are not prevented from getting other therapies or from leaving the trial entirely. They would always prefer you continue to contribute your data like I'm doing, but it's entirely up to you. And of course, more IBD patients in trials leads to more treatment options for IBD. So hopefully more people can participate. Next slide.
So this, Peter, was a study that we did in IBD Partners. And IBD Partners is a large internet-based cohort where patients fill out surveys. It's been going on since 2011. So we have over a decade of follow-up. And I would encourage you, if you haven't checked it out before, it's worldwideweb.ibdpartners.org. And this was a study where what we did is we tracked each 6 months, we asked patients about whether they are participating in a trial. And so this yellow line is the percentage of patients that were actually in a randomized controlled trial of a therapy at each time point from 2011 to 2018. And you can see that that yellow line kind of peaks around 2013 and then actually kind of starts to come down a little bit more recently. And what we did is we mapped this against the blue bars, which those are the number of active randomized controlled trials for therapy of either Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis in the US right now. So over the last decade, we've had an increasing number of clinical trials in terms of new mechanisms of action that are under study for our patients, which is wonderful for our patients. But then at the same time, in at least one national cohort of about 16,000 patients with inflammatory bowel disease, we're actually seeing fewer patients participate in clinical trials. And so the idea is there's a big gap there where if we can increase awareness, this is something that really could help to improve outcomes for our patients. And so next slide. Also within this study, we found a couple of characteristics that were associated with participation. So people with Crohn's, at least in our study, were more likely to participate in clinical trials than ulcerative colitis. And those with more severe disease, things like more hospitalizations and surgeries, were also more likely to participate, potentially those patients who had really tried many other options. The groups that seemed to be underrepresented included younger patients. Those followed in community settings, and I think this is really important. Peter and I both work at academic institutions where we run a lot of clinical trials out of our clinical trials units. And one of the things I do for almost every single one of my patients is present not only options that are associated with standard therapies and clinical care, but also clinical trial options. And in the community, there may not be as many providers who are well-versed in those clinical trials, and they may not even be presented as options for their patients. And then when we looked at those individuals that were not participating in randomized controlled trials within this IBD Partners cohort, they had mean disease activity scores that did not meet remission thresholds, meaning they were not in remission on their therapy. So this demonstrated that there are populations in need of alternate therapies for whom clinical trials could be an option, particularly if we can increase awareness. So next slide. So one way that I think is very important and a huge initiative by the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation is their online clinical trials community. And I think you'll also hear about this from our clinical trial ambassadors this evening. It has both pediatric and adult resources. It has clinical trials patient stories. It features different studies. But I think what may be most useful is it has this clinical trials finder, where you can put in your zip code, where you live, whether you have Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, and it will actually give you the contact information for various sites within whatever radius you choose, 50 miles, 100 miles, whatever it may be, who may have trials that you could call and ask about that you could potentially participate in. We have this active clinical trials ambassador program. You'll meet both Alex and Diane tonight, who are going to share their stories. These are volunteers, patients, and caregivers who participated in a clinical trial, and they're a great resource to ask questions. And the goal is really to raise awareness and encourage patients and doctors to discuss this as an option in their care. I think that you'll hear some stories from Alex and from Diane, but Peter and I have a number of these stories to share as well with our patients who participation in clinical trials was really been life-changing for them to allow them to reach a durable remission. And so we are big advocates of this for our patients because we've seen great outcomes. Next slide.
And Dr. Long, if I could jump in, we have a question
Sure.
from Deborah Paris, who asked, when a drug like Stelara has a side effect of cancer, is that a small chance or why would it be approved?
So that is a great question. And one of the things that, we're always looking for, and not only in the clinical trials, but in these phase 4 larger registries, is better understanding the safety signals associated with therapies. And what's important is in these clinical trials, you're tracking the people who got the drug and also the people who got placebo, meaning no drug. Because remember, everyone is at risk for cancer in some way, shape, or form. And if we see, 1 or 2 or 3 cases of cancer, we need to understand if that is outside the norm of what would be expected anyway, or is it potentially related to the drug. And so I will say that with Stelara, in reviewing the clinical trials for Stelara, while certainly there were a few cases of cancer, they were not different than the placebo population, meaning that we did not think that any increased risk was attributable to the drug. And so in reality, many of these therapies, you have to follow them out to help to understand kind of that cause and effect aspect. And really, that's where this slide even talks about these phase 4 registries, these observational registries, where you can get thousands and thousands and thousands of patients who are just donating their information. They're using the therapy as part of routine care. And that really helps us to look for some of these rare signals of something that we would need to know about, even if it's rare, if it is attributable to the drug. But I will say that for your specific question in regard to Stelara or ustekinumab, I think that data surrounding malignancy has actually been quite reassuring.
And then a similar follow-up question. There have been new questions about Xeljanz or tofacitinib, particularly in elderly males with heart disease. And how does the FDA, when they see a signal like that, how do they get more information? How do they study it more? And does it matter that these RA patients are on tofacitinib in combination with methotrexate, which is how it's usually given in RA?
Right. So yes, this has been a big topic recently. And so what happens with this particular drug, it's called tofacitinib or Xeljanz, used in ulcerative colitis, is that the ulcerative colitis dose is actually higher, the induction dose, than that is used in rheumatoid arthritis. And so we really need to understand not only safety signals associated with the drug, but also the dose. And so there was a recent study in rheumatoid arthritis that looked at the higher dose of tofacitinib, the regular dose, and then also it compared it to a population of patients who were on something called an anti-TNF therapy. This is an anti-tumor necrosis factor alpha that's been available and around for probably about 20 years now. So really a therapy that we think we know the safety signals associated with it. And this trial was done in older individuals who had cardiovascular risk factors, meaning they had risk factors for having heart attacks and other complications. Many were smokers. And the reason this is important is that this particular drug seems to affect the cholesterol ratio for patients. And so the FDA said, you know what, we're going to approve this drug, but this is one where we really need one of these phase 4 studies where we understand in this specific population with heart disease, what are the safety signals? And so this particular study recently showed that there was an increased risk of clotting potentially, and also in cardiovascular complications and malignancy in those individuals on the tofacitinib. And so now remember, as Peter mentioned, these were all patients that were also on methotrexate. They were all patients that were older and have other risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So it's hard to know specifically for an ulcerative colitis population if that translates. But what the FDA has done is they have come out with a recommendation that this particular drug, tofacitinib, only be used after the anti-TNF medications, and they're monitoring it very carefully. So the FDA continues to monitor these therapies even once they're out on the market to be able to provide guidance and recommendations and warnings. And so this is an area that definitively needs more research so that we can understand if these signals are there in other populations like the ulcerative colitis population. On my slide here, I'll say that the bottom right, this TOR study, is a study on tofacitinib response. That's a phase 4 real-world study that we're hoping to gain some of that information on, where a combination of sites are all combining data to look at outcomes in patients on that tofacitinib medication. So hopefully we will learn more soon.
And certainly the FDA has the right to mandate companies do additional studies, and that's what's going on with tofacitinib. These are studies that the FDA said, we want to see more data in specific populations to try to understand the risks better. And that's the drugs aren't approved and then free range. The FDA monitors them very closely.
So Peter, with our discussion about kind of studies catching rare side effects to medications, there was a question from Patricia Hollis who asked about PML and its association with Entyvio. Is that something that you would be concerned about based on all of the observational data we have available to us now?
So fortunately, Entyvio was actually designed based on natalizumab, the drug we talked about with PML, to not have effects on the brain. And, early on, there was a concern that, well, it may still be close enough to natalizumab that it might still cause PML. And just like tofacitinib being monitored, Entyvio has been monitored very, very closely for cases of PML. And at this point, other than a patient with HIV, there have not been any cases of PML reported in IBD patients treated with Entyvio. So I think at this point, and we're talking tens of thousands, probably more than hundreds of thousands of patients treated with Entyvio at this point, and 0 cases. So I'm much more confident that that is not a concern, but it's still in the label. It will probably always be in the label that it is a theoretical concern. But it's one of those that with more time and more experience, we are more and more reassured. And, in terms of the cardiac events with tofacitinib, with more time, more experience, it does seem that there are particular patients, possibly the elderly with prior heart disease, possibly also on methotrexate, who may be at higher risk. And these are the things we learn over time about new medications.
No, and I agree with that completely. Really, the fact that people have participated in these observational studies, over 100,000 patients treated, I feel very comfortable that Entyvio is not associated with the PML, which is great, which is really important. That's why participation is so key, and why we hope that even for those who are on a different effective therapy, the ability to participate in one of these observational studies and donate your data as to how you're doing on that therapy, report complications, becomes really important. And while many of these are based out of individual centers like Peter's or mine, there are many options that all you need is an internet connection. And so, for example, IBD Partners is an internet-based study where you can join, report what therapies you're on, report how you're doing clinically and symptomatically, and if you've had complications. And so I would just encourage you to participate in research at any number of levels, if not at the actual interventional level of the clinical trial, but sharing this observational data. And next slide. And I think that is it in terms of the presentation. Peter and I will still be continuing to monitor the Q&A. And I think most importantly, who we'd like to introduce next is Alex, who is one of our clinical trial ambassadors, He'll be able to tell you kind of his own personal experience with participation in a clinical trial, and we'll be able to field some questions for him as well. So Alex, please take it away.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds good. So hello, let me just get my camera lined up with, there we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining this call today. I'm excited to share my story with all of you. So my name is Alex Favreau, and I'm from Scotch Plains, New Jersey. I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease at the age of 12 and have traversed high school, college, and early adulthood living with IBD. At times, I struggled immensely, and at other times, I felt completely normal. IBD has had a way of ebbing and flowing with me where I've never been in a real remission, but I haven't really had a severe disease flare until this past year, sadly. I currently live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and work as a clinical research associate. I'm actually currently working on a COVID vaccine study, not one that is Pfizer or Moderna, but a different company. So I do have a lot of experience professionally with clinical research as well. In terms of my involvement with the foundation overall, I'm currently a member of the Patient Advisory Task Force. I'm a clinical trials ambassador, as said before, and I'm a counselor at Camp Oasis in Kittnersville, PA. I've been a camp counselor for, I think, 3 years, and I was a camper there for a while as well. So my story with clinical trials begins nearly a decade ago. After being diagnosed with Crohn's disease, I was placed on medication upon medication upon medication, and nothing really worked for me. I took prednisone for 19 months straight because nothing seemed to do the trick for me, and I really couldn't wean off of prednisone. I was at a point where I was taking like a quarter of the pill every 3 days because I just couldn't get off of it. It was really hard for someone so young to go through this. I was watching my friends play sports, be outside, enjoy their lives, and I really wasn't enjoying mine. However, that feeling did change eventually, thanks in large part to a clinical research study or a clinical trial. But first, I'll tell you about my clinical trial experience that did not go so well. So right around the time I had started high school, my doctor proposed a clinical trial to me. It was a biologic medication, so the treatment info was full of big fancy words for my parents to decipher rather than me. Collectively, we agreed that a clinical trial was the best option for me, so I enrolled in this trial. And unfortunately, after 3 very painful visits to the doctor for receiving the medication, my doctor decided that he didn't think the study was for me. So by painful, what I mean really is I lost a lot of weight around this time, and I had very little like fat or muscle or tissue, not tissue, but you know what I mean, left on my body for these subcutaneous shots to be administered. And the medication was like cold and it was a thick liquid, and I felt like I was being stabbed each time I received it. And on top of that, I really wasn't getting any better, and my blood work was showing no improvement with IBD. So I withdrew from the study, and it really broke my heart at the time. As a young, impressionable teen, I felt that there would be nothing out there for me at this point, until my doctor, reassured me that there were still many treatment options and many clinical trials still available for me to try until we found the right thing. And he was right. We eventually did. During my freshman year of high school, I enrolled in a second clinical trial for another biologic medication. And this time around, the medication made me feel exponentially better almost immediately. I ended up being on this medication for 9 years, which is kind of funny because I think Dr. Long referenced an open label extension going 9 years on the dot earlier in her presentation. So just kind of funny that that pops up again. But I took it for 9 years, and I recently switched last year for reasons unrelated to Crohn's disease, unfortunately. But thanks in part to that clinical trial, I was able to enjoy my high school career, which involved playing soccer, winning a state championship in high school swimming, and being a board member of my high school's debate club for 2 years. I was lucky enough to experience a college life that had minimal interruptions due to IBD, and it helped me stay healthy through rigorous courses and internships. If it weren't for that clinical trial, I might not have had the same fortune regarding my health on another medication. And, in the end, while it was pretty discouraging for the first clinical trial I enrolled in to have not worked out well for me, keeping an open mind helped me find the clinical trial that was right for me eventually. If it weren't for that clinical trial, I have no idea what I would be doing today, as my life might have been entirely different, and I honestly probably wouldn't be in clinical research professionally too. But overall, thanks to my doctor, my parents' hope and encouragement and support, I'm able to have this conversation with all of you today. Clinical trials, as said before by Dr. Higgins and Dr. Long, are just such an essential part of the process for discovering breakthrough medications that can really save patients' lives, both for IBD and for things like COVID going on right now and for all diseases. But the medications available for IBD today wouldn't be around without the numerous clinical trials that were involving them. Having the conversation about clinical trials with your physician, both for you or if you're a caregiver for whoever you're giving care to, they can be really nerve-wracking, but it can be a life-changing conversation. If you have any additional questions or pieces of curiosity regarding clinical trials for IBD, I would highly encourage you to visit the clinical trials community page on the Foundation's website as shown before. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alex. I bet that your 9-year trial might have been the same one my patient was in.
I think
and from that,
there's a pretty good chance.
It's a pretty good chance. But next, I'd love to introduce Diane, who's another one of our clinical trial ambassadors. And Diane comes at this from a different perspective as the parent of a participant. So Diane, thank you.
Sure. Hey all, my name's Diane Cordell, and I'm a caregiver, to an 11-year-old who was diagnosed at 7. I'm thankful for this platform to share my daughter's story and then also to meet other patients and learn from one another. Our journey was definitely an interesting one with lots of medicines, different doctors, numerous visits to different doctors, blood work, change of diets, you name it, clinical trial and a hospital visit or 2. But just as Alex mentioned, through it all, we remained positive and kept an open mind, and that's truly what helped us go through our journey. Alyssa had symptoms starting at a very young age, varying from dry skin, blood in her stool, mouth sores around school age, give or take pre-K and kindergarten. On her 7th birthday, we ended up going to the hospital due to excessive vomiting, being anemic, and dehydration. At that time, she also needed a blood transfusion. And once we got her levels at a better place, she ended up getting scopes done as well. It was after this that we got her results that we were officially diagnosed with Crohn's disease in both intestines. She started on a low dose of biologic and received her infusion every 8 weeks. Slowly but surely, we discovered that 8 weeks was just too long between doses, and we bumped infusions every 6 weeks. Eventually, her doctor at the time increased her dosing to every 4 weeks and prescribed a steroid. At this point, we knew our mother instinct, our parent gut, that what we were doing was just not working. After joining a support group and hearing from other families, we learned that changes in medication could be needed when treating IBD. So that was a little reassuring that we weren't alone. We chose to speak to our doctor and see what other options we had. We ended up finding a new doctor, modifying her diet, taking note of what Alyssa was eating with a daily journal, which was tricky for a 5-year-old at that time, 7-year-old. A lot of work, but we wanted to rule out all the factors. Alyssa then started with a new biologic just a couple months after failing her first. The medication required regular injections and definitely was scary, but Alyssa showed great bravery and strength and proved not to fear needles, unlike her mother, which if you think about how much blood work, infusions, doctor appointments, this was huge for a young child. We tried this treatment for 6 months. Alyssa had days where she was feeling better and other days where this medication was just not cutting it. And we had to try adding other medications to help eliminate the bleeding. So again, think of a 7-year-old taking, numerous medications, going to different doctors, new faces, just a lot to take in all at once. Through all of this, she still was not feeling well, and it was affecting her daily activities in school and out of school. And it was at this point that we sat as a family and shared our thoughts on what we needed to change. Was it diet? Was it something in the environment? Was it stress related? At 7, what does that look like? In the spring of 2018, our new doctor talked to us about a clinical trial that was enrolling children with Crohn's disease in UC. We were given plenty of reading materials, answers to our 1,001 questions, and at no point felt pressure to participate by any medical staff, be it our doctor, our nurse, or research nurse. We felt that joining the clinical trial would not hurt and also provide a different opportunity for us. My daughter had failed 2 other drugs, even with higher doses and increased frequency, along with attempted diet modifications. In order to see if she could qualify, she needed to get scopes done, her second one since being diagnosed, which was a little scary. So we were a little hesitant to have her go under yet again, but we understood that this was part of the process. She qualified for the clinical trial, and we were looking forward to having her to start feeling better. Our research nurse was amazing. We still check in with her every so often. Infusion staff was great. Our medical team was super attentive. And I think secretly Alyssa loved the extra attention and TLC that she was getting. No extra work was needed on our part other than the medical appointments and the blood work and occasional paperwork to fill out. The biological therapy that was tested worked well for Alyssa. We were on the right path. We were super excited. There were some good days and other days that she was a little tired. Those days were typically close to when she was due for her next infusion. We qualified for the extension of the trial in September of 2018, which changed how often she would receive her treatments. We were a little nervous, mainly because with other medications in the past, prolonging the time between her doses proved to hurt Alyssa more than to help her. We noticed that when school started, and we're in Georgia, so we go back in late July, early August, her immune system seemed weak. She struggled with infections and low energy levels. We knew that immunosuppression was one of the side effects for her medication. We brought this up to the doctor and research nurse and came to the decision that continuing the study might not be the best option for Alyssa. In January of 2019, we were taking off the study. Waiting 8 weeks for us for infusion treatments was just not working for Alyssa. Although we were super sad to no longer be part of the trial, it was truly a great experience, and we will forever be grateful to our medical staff for their continued support and encouragement. Our main recommendation to other families that are possibly looking into whether or not clinical trials will work is do your research, consult with other families, be it a support group or through the many resources that are out there through the foundation. And most of all, just be open and honest with your medical staff about your questions and concerns. There are no silly questions. There's not too many phone calls or emails to better understand the options that are out there for you or your loved one. And most importantly, know that you're not alone, that there are plenty of resources out there for you to stay informed. We truly hope that you look into the resources that the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation provides and know again that there's many opportunities for you to share and to learn together. This is a very great family and a great community to be together. Thanks so much for listening to our story.
So feel free to put more questions in the Q&A section. We've had a few on COVID vaccinations. One was about whether COVID vaccinations are safe for IBD patients and can they be given no matter where you are in your Remicade infusion cycle. And fortunately, all the currently available vaccines are not live vaccines. So that's a really fortunate thing. So these are safe for people on immunosuppression. There is no evidence that kind of trying to time it with your infusions or injections really matters. We expect that based on similar vaccinations with flu or other vaccines, it won't be quite as effective as quickly in patients on immunosuppression. So maybe instead of 95% at 8 weeks, it'll only be 75% at 8 weeks. But that effectiveness may continue to accumulate in patients on immunosuppression. So I think there's a lot of value in getting vaccinated. There are questions about the prioritization. In Michigan, IBD patients are lumped in with other patients with pre-existing conditions just after the elderly. Dr. Long, what's the situation or ordering in North Carolina?
Right. So I think Peter's point's a great one. So you'll have to check individually for your state. This is a statewide decision. And in North Carolina, it was healthcare workers, elderly. Now we're in a wave where teachers are getting vaccinated, followed by other essential workers. And then after that will be patients with chronic conditions like inflammatory bowel disease. We call it phase 4, which is right before phase 5, which is everyone. So it's going to be different depending on the state you're in, and check your own state guidance.
Okay. One other question it's really more in the theoretical realm at this point, but there's a report that the UK variant originated in Kent, England. And it appears, although it's a little bit hard to prove, that it may have originated in a patient who was significantly immunosuppressed, who could not get rid of the virus. So they had COVID circulating and detectable as live virus for weeks and weeks and weeks. And there's a suspicion that because of that, the virus had more opportunity to mutate and created this UK variant with more than 20 mutations. And so there's sort of a theoretical reason that we might want to actively prioritize immunosuppressed patients to try to prevent new variants. Although at this point, it's more of a theoretical case report.
So Peter, I think one of our clinical trial ambassadors, Alex, had a question. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll turn my video on to ask it as well. So I know that Dr. Higgins, you just mentioned that all the vaccines that are currently available are not live virus vaccines, but I was curious in terms of active inflammation or active disease versus an actual like abscess that's currently draining. If you're a patient that has an abscess that's currently draining potentially, would you have any hesitance for trying to get the vaccine in that situation?
You know, I don't think there's any particular interaction. I do think the immune response might be a little bit odd in somebody who has an actively draining abscess, in that their immune system is sort of focused on clearing the abscess. I don't know, but theoretically that might actually influence how well you respond to the vaccine. And so I'd be a little bit torn. On one hand, I would like all my patients, especially the immunosuppressed patients, to get the vaccine as soon as it's available to them. On the other hand, you know, if you could wait a week and get that drained, you might get a better vaccination response.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And similarly, patients on steroids, I would be worried that they may not respond quite as well, especially if they're on 20 milligrams or more. And so if you can wait a few weeks and taper that down to say 5 milligrams or less, they might do better with the vaccine on a lower dose of prednisone or no prednisone at all.
That's great. That's what I was going to ask as well and add. Let me get back to another question.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I was going to pose the steroid angle as a follow-up to it, but we were all on the same.
On the same page. Yeah, let's try to get that dose lower before the vaccine. So Peter, I think I know my answer to this, but I'm going to hear yours. If a patient, Mark Murray asked us, if a patient is well managed on a given IBD therapy, I assume you would not suggest that they go off it to participate in a trial for an experimental medicine. Is that correct?
Yes. You know, a lot of our medications are proteins that you can develop antibodies to. And if you stop and start, you may lose the benefit of that med and never be able to go back on it. So in general, particularly for injectable medications, I generally say ride that one as long as you can, as long as it's working. In general, I would think you'd have to have a pretty good reason to stop your therapy, either side effects, it's stopped working, or it's for whatever reason you've had an insurance change and it's not affordable anymore. I do have a patient who recently, their copay on ustekinumab just went up to $3,400 a dose. And so we're having really hard conversations about this drug that works really well for him, but he may have to, for financial toxicity reasons, have to switch.
Those are hard. Absolutely. Well, let me just finish out with, there are a couple of questions in the same vein, and we can have this be our last questions, Peter, just circling back to COVID vaccine. One of the questions that has come up a couple times in the chat is you had mentioned that you were in the AstraZeneca trial, which is made through a different technology. It's actually made through something called an adenovirus technology, as compared to the Pfizer vaccine that my kids participated in, which is actually an mRNA vaccine. And there's some questions around, do we know if those vaccine types might affect patients with inflammatory bowel disease differently?
So in general, it's hard to know. We do believe from the data we have that at the moment for COVID, the RNA vaccines are a bit more effective, particularly at the 2-dose regimen, than the adenovirus vaccines. Now, the adenovirus vaccines, if you give them enough time, by 6 months, they may be just as effective. They may just be slower acting. That being said, there's no particular reason to pick one or the other. For IBD patients, I think the rates will probably be very similar. It's possible that rather than 95% and 80% for the RNA and the adenovirus, you may slide down to 75 and 60% effective, but I would think it would be proportional.
No, absolutely. And when I'm asked this question, the answer is whatever vaccine you can get. because I want to get my patients protected. And, you know, every time a new vaccine comes out, it's studied. In fact, I'll tell you a little bit about a study we're doing now to look at these COVID vaccines, but they're studied to make sure that there is not any effect on the immune system. And each time we try to understand in terms of a flare of inflammatory bowel disease. And really to date, none of the vaccines we have studied have been shown to be associated with exacerbations of IBD. So that's important. And these data are also forthcoming for patients who will get the COVID vaccine. For those of you that are interested, there'll be a new study called Prevent COVID that is launching off of the IBD Partners homepage, and it will be a study collecting data of patients with inflammatory bowel disease who have received the COVID vaccine. And so this is how we're going to get those answers about efficacy of vaccines, about safety, about flares of inflammatory bowel disease. So I would encourage you to check back on that IBD Partners site after you do get the vaccine so that you can potentially join.
Well, Dr. Higgins, Dr. Long, I just want to thank you both so much for bringing forward your expertise, sprinkling in the Q&A throughout your entire program and presentation. I'd also like to thank Alex Favreau and Diane Cordell for providing their perspectives as well through the clinical trial journey that they've had.